So how do you find this material? Do you find it very complicated and difficult to understand, difficult to relate to? Or interesting?
Very interesting, yes.
You're interested?
Yes,
okay, well that's good.
I don't know if I understand, but it's very interesting anyway. I like it.
And also, I was just talking with Martin about this, what I mentioned earlier about being kind to yourself. That it's not healthy and not helpful to beat ourselves up if we have difficulties during meditation and so on. So the same should go for if we have difficulties understanding the teachings. If there's something we find difficult to understand, please don't beat yourself up about that. Don't feel bad. Don't. Also, comparing ourselves with others. This is something else we sometimes do. Like if you notice somebody else seems to understand something, catch on quicker than you do, then you may feel bad about that, maybe even feel jealous of that person, envious, resentful. So just watch out for these types of attitudes which can arise in our mind, and just accept, okay, yeah, this is difficult material, and people are different, so some people may be able to understand it quickly and easily, and I'm not so able to understand it, but that's okay. And what the Tibetans often say is that it's good to listen, even if we don't understand. It's still good to hear the teachings again and again and again, because it will leave imprints on our mind. And the more imprints we have, and the more time goes on, then slowly things will start to make sense. Because I know for myself, when I first started learning Buddhism, I had a really hard time with emptiness. When I heard teachings on emptiness, or I read books about emptiness, I just felt like I didn't understand at all what they were talking about, all this complicated language and so on. So it wasn't until many years later that I felt like I was starting to get some understanding of it. Now I can even talk about it. Not that I fully understand it, it's still hard for me, but I can definitely see, there's improvement there. So if you just keep going and don't give up, don't get discouraged, just keep going, keep trying, and slowly it'll start to make more sense. There's this story, you may have heard this story, I'll tell it again, it's kind of a funny story. This great Indian master named Vasubandhu, who lived, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. And he was brilliant, and he had memorized, just huge chunks of scriptures. And every day he would recite what he had memorized, just out loud, he'd just go over these recitations. And there was a bird, like they say a pigeon, living in the roof of his house. And so when he was reciting the text, the pigeon would hear this recitation. And as a pigeon, it probably didn't really understand very much what was being said. But then it says that when the pigeon died, it was reborn as a person, a boy, in a nearby village. And then later, when he got older, that boy became a student of Vasubandhu, and he was particularly quick to understand the particular teachings, the scriptures that he had heard in his previous life as a bird. So they give that as an illustration of how, even if we can't really understand the teachings, it's still good to hear them. They leave imprints on our mind, and then later when we're in different conditions, different circumstances, we will be able to understand them. So, yeah, just in case you notice, feeling bad about yourself, or putting yourself down, or feeling discouraged, or whatever, again, recognize that state of mind, that kind of attitude isn't helpful, isn't kind. You're not being kind to yourself, And it's not nice to be unkind to yourself, just as it's not nice to be unkind to others. So just treat yourself well. Be kind to yourself. Okay, so we went through, in a rough way, those two types of phenomena, impermanent and permanent phenomena. And in this way of explaining phenomena, it said that whatever exists is either one of those two. Whatever exists is either impermanent or it's permanent. There's nothing beyond that, nothing which isn't one of those two. And there also isn't anything which is both of those two. Those two things are like opposite. It can't be both, and it can't be neither. Does that make sense?
And it be like just like yin and yang also. Yin and yang is you have the other cannot exist from.
They definitely, yeah, I mean, they're not like totally contradictory. And like we were saying, how space, which is a permanent phenomena, pervades everything. So even where this table is, the table itself is a impermanent phenomena, but it's pervaded by space. So there's space here where the table is, and also emptiness. Yeah. You know, the emptiness of the table is also here. So it's not that they're totally contradictory or they can't abide together. So they are complementary. And then moving now on to the two truths. So the two truths are also this type of division of things, in the sense that whatever exists is either a conventional truth or an ultimate truth. There's nothing which isn't one of those two. So it's a way of dividing all phenomena, whatever exists in the world, in the universe, in ourselves, outside of ourselves. Whatever exists is either one or the other. Okay, so now just to give a general introduction to the two truths. The two truths are, some different translators use different terms. Some use the term relative truth, others conventional truth. So those are just different translations, but it's talking about the same thing. So relative or conventional truth is talking about just the ordinary reality, the ordinary way that things exist, how things appear on the relative or conventional level. And then the other truth, absolute truth or ultimate truth, again, those are just alternate translations for the same thing, is talking about the deeper reality, the way that things really exist, how they really are. And this topic is important because according to Buddhism, remember the Buddha was very concerned about the suffering in the world. He was aware of all the different kinds of suffering and really moved by suffering and really motivated to find a way to end suffering. Not just for himself, but for others. So he set out on this spiritual quest, path of meditation, and he did achieve what he was looking for. He achieved a state of being free of suffering. And then after that, he spent the rest of his life teaching how to do that, teaching people that you too can be free of suffering, and this is how to do it. And so what the Buddha discovered was that the basic root cause of suffering, both our own individual suffering, our own problems, as well as the problems in the world, war and poverty, injustice, corruption, and so forth, all of these problems are rooted in ignorance, ignorance of the true nature of things. Ignorance that doesn't see things as they actually are, but instead sees things in a mistaken way, in a false way, seeing things existing in a way they actually do not. So when our mind is under the control of ignorance, overwhelmed by ignorance, it's like it's as though we are hallucinating. We are seeing things that aren't really there, aren't really true. But we don't know it. Those people who walk around thinking that they know how things are, they see the true nature of things, and not even aware that they're hallucinating. I was going to sneeze. So then, if that is the case, if you can accept that we see things in a mistaken way, and by seeing things in a mistaken way, we get ourselves into all kinds of problems. We generate attitudes like hatred, anger, aggressiveness, violence, and so forth, and then we do harmful things. Or, on the other hand, we develop attachment, desire, clinging, craving, which can also lead to unskillful kinds of behavior and many other disturbing emotions as well. So, if we can accept that all these problems come from ignorance, not seeing the true nature of things, then it's important to understand, well, what is the true nature of things? How is it that things really exist? And that's, well, in the if you've attended teachings from Tibetan Lamas, then you've probably heard their explanation that the true nature of things is emptiness, or shunyata, the absence of inherent existence, the absence of true existence. So there's various terminology that they use. And so emptiness is the true nature of things, the ultimate nature of things, the ultimate truth. So that's what the ultimate truth is. And that's what we need to understand to be free of suffering. And so that's why this topic is important. It's because not seeing the truth, not seeing the true nature of things, we are confused, we get ourselves caught up in suffering and problems, and we create problems for other people and so forth. And so if we want to stop creating suffering and problems for ourselves and others, we need to understand the true nature of things. And that's the ultimate truth. But there's also relative truth. So there's two levels of truth, two levels of reality. And so I'm saying this because it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's not just something interesting to learn about and talk about, but it's very relevant to our life and to our wish to be happy and free from suffering. And also, as I mentioned last night, to become enlightened, it's said that we need two factors, which are compared to the two wings of a bird. A bird can only fly if it has two wings, not only one. And in the same way, to ascend to the state of enlightenment, we need these two factors, which are called wisdom and method. And method is that side of the path where we develop love and compassion and generosity and patience, all the positive qualities, and engage in positive actions to benefit others and so forth. The other side, the other wing of the path, is wisdom. And wisdom is developing the understanding of how things really exist, the true nature of things. So if we only have one of those two, but lack the other, then our practice will not be correct. We won't be able, we'll be lopsided, just like a bird trying to fly with just one wing. It's not going to be able to get off the ground. So in the same way, if we only have method but not wisdom, or if we only have wisdom and not method, we won't be able to progress to enlightenment. So we do need both in a complementary way. So again, that's how or why it's so important to have wisdom that understands the true nature of things. And another very important quality mentioned in on the Buddhist path is faith. And there are different types of faith. One type of faith is, we use the term in English, blind faith. You heard that? Yeah. Blind faith is when people don't really have much understanding, but it's more emotional. They just feel this faith in some person or some object or some theory, some idea. But if you ask them, you know, what is your understanding of that? How much do you really understand? They may not really understand so much, but it's just a feeling that they have. And so that's one type of faith. But another type of faith is based on understanding. In the Buddhist tradition, they call it faith of belief. Maybe that's not such a good term, but what it means is when you have really investigated, you really learned and studied and investigated the object of your faith, the object that you have faith in, and asked all your questions, expressed all your doubts, and really, you know, worked out what exactly is this, then you reach a point where you have faith that's based not on just emotion, but on real, a good understanding, you know, having really investigated and come to a conclusion about what it is you have faith in. So it's said that that type of faith is the best one to have because it's very strong, it's very definite, certain. Even if somebody comes along and tries to shake you out of your faith, tries to present some opposing point of view, but you won't be affected by that because you know for sure, you know, you're 100% convinced that this is true. So that can be related to this quotation that I mentioned before about what the Dalai Lama said about the two truths, and saying that, you know, in the beginning it's good to learn the two truths, and then on top of that the Four Noble Truths, and then on the top of that taking refuge. So what he's talking about is having a really good understanding of the true nature of things, how things exist on the level of the two truths, relative truth, conventional truth, and ultimate truth. And then on top of that, the Four Noble Truths. And if you really go through that process, understand very well all those different points, and really think deeply about them and really come to a conviction of them, then on the basis of that, when you take refuge, your taking of refuge is really well grounded. It's grounded in understanding rather than just emotional, you know, emotional feeling. Oh, I have such a good feeling for that Lama, you know, I want to take refuge and be a Buddhist and follow him. But you haven't really, you know, looked carefully into the whole thing. So again, that's why it's very useful to understand the two truths. Then the faith that we have arising from that will be much more certain, definite. So it is a somewhat difficult or challenging topic. So if you find it difficult, if you feel a little lost or confused or you don't fully understand, please don't worry. It is difficult. But don't give up, don't get discouraged. Just think, okay, I find it hard now, but if I keep trying, keep listening to teachings and reading and thinking, eventually I will be able to understand it better. And also it said that just making the effort to understand this topic, that itself is very beneficial. In fact, I've heard from my teachers, they say, you know, we talk about how important it is to create merit, to accumulate merit, positive energy, making offerings, reciting prayers, mantras, and so forth. There's different ways we can create merit. Merit is like positive energy that helps our mind to actually transform. We were talking before about transforming the mind. So for the mind to be able to transform and start to get realizations and, you know, start to attain these higher states of mind, we need positive energy. We also need to purify, clear away the more negative aspects of the mind. So we need those two things, creating positive energy, clearing away negative energy. So it said that trying to understand emptiness, or any aspect of Buddhist philosophy, really putting an effort into studying and understanding these, that itself is a way to accumulate a lot of merit, positive energy, and also to purify. Actually, some years ago when I was doing the master's program, a few of my classmates went to a retreat that Lama Zopa Rinpoche was leading, and they had a little interview with him. And Rinpoche said to them, he said how good it was, how wonderful it was that they were doing this study. And he said that, I never heard this before, it was something new. You know, in the Tibetan tradition they talk about preliminary practices, ngundro. These are practices, they're actually preparatory practices before practicing Tantra. And they're practices mainly to purify, clear away negative energy, negative karma, and so forth, and build up positive energy. So they're practices like doing prostrations and doing Vajrasattva and so on. So yeah, this is a common practice in the Tibetan tradition to do. Usually the number is 100,000 repetitions of these practices. And this is called a ngundro. And so Rinpoche said that there's actually 3 levels of ngundro, or 3 ways of doing ngundro. One is this usual one, doing 100,000 prostrations, 100,000 mandala offerings, 100,000 vajrasattvas, and so forth. Another way of doing it is reciting one of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. I think it's maybe the long one. There's different Perfection of Wisdom sutras of different length. And the longest one is 100,000 verses. And then there's another one that's 20,000 verses, and another one that's 8,000 verses. And then there's the Heart Sutra, which is really short. But there's really long versions of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So I think he said the longest one, I think, the 100,000 verse Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, reading that 100 times or something like that, which is a lot because it's huge, you know, it's like this big. So that's another way of doing your ngundro. And he said the third way is to study the great treatises, like the ones they study in the monasteries, the Indian treatises, to study those. So, for example, those who are going for the Geshe degree, who are spending 15 or 20 years in a monastery studying these texts, like this Dutch monk that I mentioned last night. So that's another way of doing the ngundro, purification and accumulation of merit. And Rinpoche said, of those 3, that's the best one. So the best way to do your ngundro is actually to study the great treatises. So that points out how beneficial it is. And my guess is, even if you don't fully understand everything, just making the effort to study and understand is very powerful, very beneficial. And also there's this famous quotation from one of the Indian masters named Arya Deva. He was a disciple of Nagarjuna. And he wrote a text called the 400 Verses. 400 Verses, it's all about emptiness. And in that text, there's a verse that I'll just to paraphrase it. He says, even just to have doubt about the nature of reality shakes the foundations of samsara, cyclic existence. So it said that, like a lot of people don't have any kind of doubt like that. A lot of people just go through life assuming that everything exists the way they see it. They never have any doubt. Well, do I really see things the way they are, or is there some other level of reality? So many people never even question that. They just kind of go through and do things as the status quo. But it said that people who do have a doubt, who start to wonder, well, is this really what's real? Is this all there is? Is there some other level of reality behind what normally appears to me? So even have a doubt like that, They say it requires quite a bit of merit. You have to have a lot of merit, a lot of positive energy, just to have that kind of doubt. And so even to have a doubt about the reality of things and wonder, how do things really exist, just that kind of doubt already starts to crack the solid foundations of samsara, unenlightened existence. So anyway, they use that verse to point out how useful it is even to look into this topic, even if we don't fully understand it, but just to start working at it, start looking at it, start wondering about it is very beneficial. Okay, so in this module then, on the two truths, we're going to look at how the two truths are explained by different schools of philosophy. So if you look on the back page of these notes, there's a heading that says Tenets, Schools of Buddhism. And it's a little small, but this is a kind of graph that shows the different schools of thought within Buddhism. So it isn't the case that all Buddhists think the same way or explain things in the same way. There are actually different points of view within Buddhism. And there's actually a topic, a subject that comes later in the basic program, where we look more carefully at these different schools and how they explain different things, such as the two truths and so on. So right now we're not going to go into all the details, but just briefly look at how they explain the two truths. So there's four main schools. The second row of names going across. One is called the Vaibhashika, or Great Exposition School, and the second is Sotrantika, or the Sutra School, and then the third over is the Chittamatra, or Mind-Only School, and the fourth is the Madhyamika, or the Middle Way School. So those are the four main schools, and then some of those have sub-schools, subdivisions, schools within the schools. Now, there's a lot of discussion about these schools and how they came about, where they came about. Geshe Tashi, there's this book which is written by Geshe Tashi Tsering, teacher in London. And he developed a program called Foundations of Buddhist Thought, which people can attend in London, but also it's offered online. So it's a really, really good program. It goes into some of these points. And that program, Foundations of Buddhist Thought, which I think runs for about 2 years, the first module is mainly on the Four Noble Truths, and the second is on the Two Truths. So this book is related to that program. So it's called Relative Truth, Ultimate Truth. So if you're really interested in this topic of the Two Truths, this is a good book. A good book. There's another book that's very good. It's called Appearance and Reality by Guy Newland, American professor. And this also goes through how the two truths are explained by the four schools.
Who was the author?
Guy, G-U-Y, G-U-Y, Guy, and Newland, N-E-W-L-A-N-D, Newland. It's published by Snowlion. So just to let you know, if you really are interested in this topic, those are books on it. So in this book of Geshe Tashi, he gives a bit of a historical background behind these four different schools and how they came into existence. So he said that during the time of the Buddha, and for maybe the first 200 years after the Buddha passed away, the Buddha and his teachings were not particularly prominent because there were actually many teachers, many masters with their followers in India. And so the Buddha and his followers were just one among a number of teachers and systems in India. And then in the 1st century BC, a king by the name of Ashoka, have you heard of King Ashoka? He was a king who ruled most of the Indian subcontinent, except for one little area, but he was the ruler of most of that area. And he has an interesting life. In the early part of his life, he was a warrior. He was, really into fighting and conquering, and he probably did kill a lot of people and caused a lot of suffering. But then at some point he changed his ways, changed his mind, and became nonviolent, became a Buddhist. And then because he was the ruler over this huge mass of land, it sounds like he didn't really try to convert people, but he just spread the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha's message, as much as he could throughout India, and even into Central Asia. When I first went to India, I went overland through Afghanistan and discovered that, you may know this as well, in Afghanistan at one point in time there was a whole civilization of Buddhism, these big Buddhas carved into the side of the mountains, which unfortunately were destroyed by the Taliban. But so Buddhism was actually spread right into Central Asia, and even over as far as Egypt and Greece, there were some Buddhist influences. So this happened during the time of King Ashoka. So as a result of his work, his spreading of Buddhism did become a major religious tradition. And then subsequent to that, because it was very well established, then there developed monasteries, places where people were studying and also engaging in debate, discussion about the Buddha's teachings and practices and so forth. For example, Nalanda Monastery. Have you heard of Nalanda Monastery? So this is in northern India, not far from Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha attained enlightenment. And it flourished for about 1,000 years between the 2nd and 13th centuries. And tens of thousands of monks studied there and practiced and taught and composed texts and so on. And the Dalai Lama often talks about how the Tibetan Buddhism, the Buddhism of Tibet, is really that tradition. It's the Nalanda tradition, the great masters from Nalanda Monastery who went into Tibet and spread the teachings there. So it was after that time that Buddhism became well established, and then people began debating and discussing and debating the meaning of the teachings, that these different schools arose. So the first of the 4 schools is called Vaibhashika, and I'm skipping over some of the material, but we can go back to it later. So on the bottom of page 3 of your notes, there's the point, the 2 truths is explained by the Vaibhashika school. So each of these 4 schools has a different way of explaining the 2 truths. And it's useful to go through this explanation because in the Tibetan tradition we are usually exposed to the explanation of the Madhyamika school, which is the fourth of the four schools. And the Tibetans are pretty unanimous in considering the Madhyamika school to be the best, the most correct, the most accurate way of explaining things. So they always go by that view. However, the Madhyamika way of explaining things is actually quite difficult, quite subtle. This is the school that explains emptiness. So if you have heard teachings on emptiness or tried to read books on emptiness, you've probably found that it's not difficult. It's not easy to understand. It's actually quite difficult, quite subtle, quite profound. And so one reason that it's beneficial to go through the different schools, starting with the Vaibhashika, the first school, is that they are progressively more difficult. So the first school of Vaibhashika is relatively easier to understand. It's a more coarse or more gross way of explaining things. So if we can get an understanding of that and then go step by step through the other schools, by the time we get to the Madhyamika, it won't seem so difficult. So this is what they do in the monasteries. The monks and nuns studying to be geshis, they study this. They study the different schools because they say it's like going step by step, going up a ladder, going up a staircase, starting with the less difficult school and then gradually going up to the higher one. And then by the time you get to the Madhyamika, it's less difficult. So that's why I thought to do it in that way. Now we're not going to go into all the details about each of these four schools, but just focus on how they explain the two truths, relative truth and ultimate truth. So this first school is called Vaibhashika, and that's the Sanskrit term. When translated into English, it's translated as the Great Exposition School. And the reason for this name is it's named after a text which was called the Great Detailed Exposition. And this was a text that was a compilation of a number of other texts of Abhidharma. So historically, as I mentioned before, there's these three baskets of the Buddhist teachings, the Vinaya, the Sutra, and the Abhidharma. So the Abhidharma are all the teachings related to wisdom, understanding the true nature of things, how things exist. And so there are various treatises on Abhidharma. It mentions here 7 treatises of manifest knowledge, or Abhidharma. And so these are very early scriptures, going back to the early days of Buddhism. And this text, called the Great Detailed Exposition, was a summary, a compilation of these 7 treatises. And so this school, the Great Exposition School, bases their explanations of things, their assertions about things on that text. So they're very much related to the Abhidharma. And there's a very complicated explanation, which I haven't studied, but they say there were actually 18 different sub-schools that developed shortly after the Buddha passed away. And each one of these has different names and different assertions about things. It seems that they just came up with different positions about things that the Buddha taught. And so this term Vaibhashika, this school, is actually an umbrella term that covers all of these 18 different sub-schools. So this isn't so important. We don't need to know all of that. But what's important here is just to understand that this school is one of the earliest ones to develop after the Buddha passed away. And a quality of this school is that they are concerned with phenomenology, abhidharma, breaking things up into different categories and analyzing them, analyzing their qualities, their properties, and so forth. And it's not sure whether or not nowadays in the world there are still people following this particular school. In fact, with regard to these 4 different schools, now the 4th school, the Madhyamika school, is still very much alive and kicking because the Tibetans, as far as I know, all the Tibetans followed that school. So the Madhyamika school is very much alive. And the Chittamatra school also, that's one of the other 4 schools, also seems to be alive. The Zen tradition, it seems, as far as I can tell, mainly follows that school, that explanation of things. And now the views that are found in the Vibhashika school and the Sautrantika school were most probably the views found in the Theravada countries. Although they may not say, well, I'm a Vibhashika or I'm a Sautrantika, but the viewpoints that are found in the Vibhashika and Sautrantika schools are views of followers, Buddhist followers in the Theravada countries. This is just an estimate. Now, there's a lot of discussion among Western scholars about the validity of these different schools, and you know, the way that the Tibetans sort of divide them up. But that isn't such an important thing, whether or not these schools really exist as they're explained by the Tibetans. The important thing is that there are viewpoints, ways of understanding things, ways of thinking attributed to these different schools. And these viewpoints are worth thinking about, worth considering, because they are viewpoints that anybody could come up with. You know, they're like hypothetical ideas. And if we explore their viewpoints, whether or not they're really people who think this way doesn't matter so much. These are possible ways of thinking. And it's useful to explore them because they say that by doing that, it sharpens our wisdom, makes our wisdom sharper, and then makes it easier for us to deal with the Madhyamika explanation of things, rather than just, you know, sometimes we just have the tendency to just believe whatever we're told. Somebody tells us things are like this, we say, okay, yeah. We don't really think about it, you know, we just, yeah, somebody who seems to be an authority, who seems to look like they know what they're saying, we just believe what they're saying. So the Buddhist tradition is, we shouldn't be like that. I mean, the Buddha himself said, you know, he said, don't just believe what I said. Don't just believe what I'm telling you. Use your own intelligence, investigate it, check it out, see if it's true or not. So thinking and investigating and questioning and, you know, trying to understand the truth of things is very much a part of Buddhism and very much encouraged. The Dalai Lama says this as well. He says, it's, you know, a lot of the Tibetans tend to just have blind faith. They just believe what they're told. And he says, don't do that. You should study, you should think, you should investigate, have doubts, question. So he very much encourages that. And so this faculty of the mind that is able to question, is this true or not? And what about this? And what about that? Is very much encouraged. They say it's a very important quality to have, to be able to really finally understand emptiness. And that's why you've probably seen and heard in the monasteries, the monks and nuns do this debating. You know, they get into pairs and then they shout at each other. I mean, they're actually debating what the Buddha taught, these kind of ideas. But they say it's really helpful to make your wisdom very, very sharp and clear. And we need that kind of sharp, clear wisdom to be able to understand reality, the true nature of things. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Okay, so this school, the Vaibhashika school, there's a box on page 4 that gives their version of the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth. Okay, so conventional truth, their explanation of conventional truth is, now truth, this word truth here, we might normally think of truth as just something abstract, an idea, something we think about. But in Buddhism, when we talk about the two truths or even the four truths, we're not just talking about ideas, we're talking about actual things. Actual things, like even this table, okay? This table is a truth. But which kind of truth is it? That's the question. Okay, so conventional truth, a conventional truth is a phenomenon that is such that if it were physically broken or mentally separated into parts, it would cease to exist as that phenomenon. In other words, when the object is broken or taken apart in some way, then we no longer have a mind that apprehends that object as it is. So, to make that more clear, the example they usually give is a clay pot or a clay vase, a porcelain vase, maybe we could say. So, if that is smashed with a hammer or thrown on the floor and broken into many, many pieces, then we no longer see a pot there. We no longer, we don't look at those pieces, those broken fragments, and see a pot or think there's a pot there, right?
I think it's a broken pot.
Well, I guess it depends on how broken it is. If it's just maybe one little chip, then we would say it's a broken pot and let's get some super glue and put it back together. But if it's really hundreds of pieces, would you still call it a broken pot?
Ground down to dust.
Yeah. I mean, it was a pot and now it's broken. But, would you still see a pot there? That's the point. Huh?
The absence of a pot.
Absence of a pot, yeah. The cessation of a pot. That was just pieces of a pot. So that's the example that they use. Now, that's an example of something that's a physical material object, which can be physically broken apart or taken apart, and when it is broken or taken apart and we no longer see that object, we no longer look at that object and say that is a pot or that is a chair or that is a whatever, that is an example of a conventional truth. So basically a conventional truth is something that can be taken apart, either physically or mentally. Yeah, can be taken apart, broken apart. Because they would say the same with mind or consciousness. It's possible. We can't physically take the mind apart because it's not a physical thing, but we can mentally break the mind down into components. We can say, oh, there's this kind of mind and that kind of mind, and also over time, there's one moment and the next moment and the next moment, so we can separate the mind into its components over time. Okay, And so they say if and when we do separate an object into its components, and by doing that we no longer see the object that appeared before, then that would be a conventional truth. Now it might be a little more clear if we look at the ultimate truth, because the ultimate truths rather, are the opposite of that. So an ultimate truth is a phenomenon that is such that if it was physically broken or mentally separated into parts, it would not cease to exist as that phenomenon. So what's an example of an ultimate truth? So according to this school, there are particles of matter, very, very small, subtle particles of matter that can't be broken down any further. They are like the basic building blocks of everything else. It's I guess, similar to what was formerly believed in physics or in science, right? Before quantum mechanics came along, it was believed that there were these little particles that were the building blocks. You know, they came together and formed bigger particles, and then formed, you know, our bodies and the chairs and the walls and all the physical things in the universe, right? So then quantum physics came along and blew that theory out the window. That's not true. They haven't been able to find these tiny basic building blocks of phenomena. But this school, which, you know, goes back 2,000 years, they do believe that there are these very tiny particles which cannot be divided, cannot be broken any further. And they form the basic, you know, building blocks for larger materials. So those tiny particles are considered to be ultimate truths, according to this school. Now, why do they say these are ultimate truths? Basically because they can't be broken down any further. They have particular qualities that are... Now, this school doesn't believe in emptiness, okay? So put aside your views, whatever you've heard about emptiness from the Tibetans, from the Madhyamika school. This school doesn't assert that. So this school does say that things like, you know, material phenomena do have existence from their own side. You know, they are truly existing. They are inherently existing. So they say that there are these tiny little particles of matter that really exist out there from their own side and can't be broken down any further. They have particular qualities on their own, and those form the building blocks for larger things, like our bodies, like all the physical things in the world, in the universe. And those are considered to be ultimate truths. And another example of an ultimate truth is, they say with the mind, there are also partless moments of mind. Like the mind can be broken down to a certain extent, but eventually you come to certain basic components of the mind which can't be broken down any further in terms of time. And so those will also be considered ultimate truths. Those partless moments of mind, you know, come together and build up to larger moments of mind. So this may sound strange. It's not something we've heard before, but this is the view of this school. Yeah.
And I was just thinking, I'm guessing that, you know, most people would think that something has to really exist, you know, at the very bottom for everything else to kind of build on top of that. If there's nothing that actually exists at the end of that chain, so most people would, I'm just imagining if you ask someone on the street, that's kind of the view they hold, even though they maybe haven't formulated it themselves.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Because if nothing actually exists at the end of the chain. How can anything exist?
That's why, yeah, quantum physics, quantum mechanics is so difficult to comprehend, because it just goes very much against the way things normally appear to us.
And, sorry, what's your point about string theory, if you know?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
And I read it like all the quartz, they are made up of strings, vibrations, and they are pure energy. And they come out with an concept of multiverse. So it's like physical quantum theory. So if you knew about, so I wanted to know.
Yeah, no, I'm not knowledgeable at all about science. I've just heard little bits of things here and there, but the Dalai Lama does have discussions with scientists, including physicists, and apparently just a couple of years ago, when he was teaching in New York, somebody asked him for advice on how to start to get an understanding of emptiness. And his advice was to study quantum mechanics. So, I don't know the difference between quantum mechanics and quantum physics. I used to think it was called quantum physics, and then recently I heard they're using quantum mechanics
I think
instead.
they're synonymous, really.
Yeah, because mechanics sounds, I don't know, repairing cars. You know. Yeah, anyway, so there does seem to be a similarity between the findings in quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and the Madhyamika explanation of ultimate truth, of emptiness. So this system, their way of explaining things, is much more gross. It's more like Newtonian physics, I guess, right? It's Newtonian physics that believed in the basic building blocks of matter. You know, you get down to a certain point and there's these solid things there that, you know, they have their own way of existing, their own reality, their own substance. So this school seems to be like that. But we shouldn't, look down on them, because it's still, I think, quite their explanation of things is still quite helpful in various ways. We'll have a break now, but when it comes to the topic of selflessness, I mean, it's not that they don't have emptiness as explained by the Madhyamika school, but they do talk about selflessness, the absence of a self, the absence of a permanent, real I or self or me. And it is that itself is subtle and helpful for us. So I'll talk about that a bit more when we come back from our break. Because in this school, one would contemplate how, looking at oneself, one's own being, one would come to see that basically there's just these particles, a little bit like what we were doing earlier today in the meditation on emptiness, that we are made up of all these particles that are impermanent, changing moment by moment. And on top of that, there's our mind, but that's also made up of parts, not physical parts, but mental parts of consciousness. And those are also changing moment by moment. So it's like there's just this mass of physical and mental parts or components changing moment by moment by moment by moment. So you look at that really, really carefully and come to see that there's no permanent abiding self, me, I, in any of this. And then that helps you break through this illusion of a permanent self, a permanent I, which believing in and grasping to leads to so much suffering, so many problems. So it's not quite as subtle as the Madhyamika view, which goes somewhat deeper than that, but it's still very subtle, very, very helpful, very profound in dealing with our mind and our emotions and our view of things, which tends to get us into problems. So we'll talk more about that after the break. And so let's take a break now for 15 minutes.